I'm going to talk about what actually initiates the descent. When you feel that all of a sudden the engines goes from that kind of equal, even humming to suddenly going down to being almost quiet and the aircraft just suddenly pitches down. What is that? Normally, we'll be cruising between 36,000 and 40,000 feet. To get down from that altitude takes about 30 to 35 minutes to do. The way we tend to calculate this is we look at our altitude. We need in a 737-800 about 3 times our altitude in nautical miles, plus 1 nautical mile for each 10 knots to decelerate down to 200 knots. Perfectly normal, and the way that the sound goes down from, quite loud to almost silent, also normal because we tried to do an idle descent down to our destination. Number 2, cloud transition. This is by far the biggest reason that people get nervous during the descent. As soon as you enter into cloud, the aircraft starts shaking and you start feeling, either quite bad turbulence, but at least a little bit of turbulence. In order to understand this, you need to understand how clouds are formed in the first place. So if you're looking at these nice kind of fluffy white good weather clouds, they're called cumulus clouds, and they form when the sun heats up an area of the ground to a point where a bubble of hot and moist air is released from the ground. Now that bubble, which has the moisture inside of it, climbs upwards, and as it climbs upward, the temperature inside of the bubble decreases with something called the dry adiabatic lapse rate, which is about 3 degrees per 1,000 feet. So it will continue to get colder and colder, and at some point the water vapor that's inside of this air bubble will reach its dew point, and when it does, the water vapor will turn into droplets. That's what you see when the clouds are forming. This is also why, if you're looking out on a good weather day, you see that all clouds are almost at exactly the same altitude, and that's because when the water vapor goes to droplets, it's actually releasing energy. It goes from a higher energy state to a lower energy state and releases energy, and that's the change in lapse rate. And when that happens, it will cause changes in conformity in the way that the air is moving. So you'll have slightly different air movement inside of the clouds. You will also have a little bit of different density inside of the cloud, but also the fact that the cloud still is moving upwards is also causing turbulence. So this is why when you come and you descend and you get into the cloud, you immediately get into this difference in lapse rate and this difference in energy state and the actual fact that the air is moving upwards, and that will cause turbulence. Now, is this dangerous then? No. We in front, the pilots, we will have our weather radar constantly scanning. As soon as we go into clouds, the weather radar is scanning and we're looking for it. Number 3, changes in configuration. So the first thing that you might notice when it comes to this is if we are during the descent, all of a sudden you start to feel a kind of high frequency shudder in the aircraft. If you look out on the wings then, you will probably see some panels that are standing up on the wings. Now these are called spoilers, air spoilers, and what we're doing at that point is we're trying to get rid of some energy of the aircraft. All of a sudden, air traffic control comes in and tells us, listen, there's no traffic, you can go straight for the ILS, and give us a shortcut. We will have too high energy state then, as in the aircraft will be too high up, that's the potential energy, and potentially with too high speed. And the way that we get rid of that is we increase the speed, that will give us a bit more drag, and we also use the speed brake. And when the speed brake is being pulled up, those spoilers comes up, and that causes this kind of low rumbling, this high frequency buffeting that you're feeling. Perfectly normal. When we get closer to the airport, we need to start slowing the aircraft down. And the reason for that is because the wings of the aircraft, they're built to fly as economically and efficiently as possible at high altitude, at high speed. But as we getting into land, we need to get the aircraft down to speed where we can slow it down on the runway, because the runway is only so long. The way to do that is simply changing the shape and the size of the wings. So we have something called high lift devices. Those are the flaps that you see on the back side of the wings that are being extended and moved downwards, and the slats that comes out in the front. And what you will feel is, once again, that little kind of high frequency shudder. And you might also feel that you are kind of moving forward, like you're being decelerated in your seat. If you're sitting over the overwing exits or over the wheel well bay, you might hear kind of a metallic whirring sound. That sound is the hydraulic motors that's driving the flaps out, because the flaps are being driven out by like a screw, right? It's a screw that's kind of moving them outwards to make sure that they move at exactly the same rate so that we don't get any adverse kind of handling from it. The next configuration change that everyone thinks about is when we drop the gear. And that will happen at about 5 nautical miles or 4 nautical miles away from the runway. So this is the last kind of 3 minutes of the flight. And what happens is that when we move the gear down, that will release the mechanical uplock that holds the gear in place. And when it does, the load of the gear plus hydraulic motors will move the gear into position and lock it in position. And when it does, you will hear the kind of click, and that sound is when these huge landing gears goes out into the airstream. When this happens, we are flying with probably 300 to 350 kilometers per hour. So if you take this big landing gear and you put it into an airstream that's moving at 350 kilometers per hour, you will get a lot of drag. So you'll feel that, you'll move forward once again, and also you will hear it. It'll be this low rumbling noise. And that is just the air flowing past the gear. Number 4. What is up with these changes in thrust on final approach? Why does it go from being fairly uniform during the entire cruise and descent, and all of a sudden when you get onto the final approach, the aircraft starts moving around all over the place and you can hear the engines revving up and revving down all the time? Well, this is because when we get down into the lower air layers, there's going to be more mechanical turbulence. When we're descending in towards the runway, we need to keep ourselves both bang on the localizer and glide slope, like we are pointing exactly the right way towards the runway. We cannot let the aircraft deviate either left or right or up or down. So it becomes more and more important for us to manually keep the aircraft where it's supposed to do. And that requires more kind of fine-tuning of the controls. And also, as we're getting closer to the runway, when we have all of our flaps hanging out, we have a smaller speed margin that we need to keep in. Okay? Because we cannot go slower than our minimum speed. That would be dangerous. And we cannot go much higher either, because with all of these flaps hanging out, they have a maximum speed, because we don't want to put too much pressure on these huge flaps that's hanging out. So that gives us a fairly small speed margin. So we need to be both very accurate on our speed keeping and very accurate on our lateral and horizontal distance. We are sitting up in the front, doing our job, getting the aircraft into that sweet spot we need to fly in order to land the aircraft at the correct point on the runway. Final point I want to mention are hard or firm landings and the use of reversal. So when we're flying into airport, we have a very defined area on the runway called the touchdown zone. That's where the aircraft is calculated to land. It's not in the first part of the runway, like people might think that we want to land as early as possible. It is about 300 meters in on the runway. So no matter how long the runway is, that's where this should be landing. So we are counting on doing that. That's our priority. A soft landing might or might not happen. It is more important that it's a firm landing on the mark than it's a soft landing further in on the runway. So if we have a short turnaround time, well then we might need to use reversers in order to bring a lot of energy away from the brakes so that the brake can cool down and be cool enough in order for us to do our takeoff later on. But generally speaking, hard braking and a lot of reversers only tends to mean that either it's a short runway, but in most cases we just have different intersections on the runway which we can take in order to taxi back to the terminal. So if you have an intersection that you want to take in order to minimize the taxi time, we might brake harder than we would do because of the runway length. We have plenty of runway left, but we don't want to spend 10 minutes taxiing, so we try to make the first exit so that we can taxi slowly and get back to the terminal quickly and get you guys off so that you can go on to whatever you're going to.